Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 1022B. And today's date is July 14th, 2016. And the title of the episode is U.S. Backed in a Corner. What is the U.S. government's next move in the Middle East? Let's get into the economic collapse, political, and geopolitical news. Now, on Friday, we know Anonymous and others are calling for a day of rage. And this is going to be happening in about, 37 cities or so. But very interestingly, DeRay McKesson of Black Lives Matter, he spent 4.5 hours at the White House discussing race relations with Obama ahead of the Day of Rage. Now, Brittany Packnett, a Minneapolis-based Black Lives Matter leader, also attended the White House meeting. And there were certain law enforcement officials and other civil rights leaders, politicians in this meeting. Now, this is something that we need to watch out for. We need to watch it very carefully, and we understand that the U.S. government, central bankers, and others can use this to push their agenda. Now, we know for a fact we had a call for this, I think it was like last year or so, where they were going to have this in many different cities, and it never really got off the ground. This time, we're going to have to watch the situation very closely. Who knows? Maybe that was a trial run. Maybe they tried it, see what things they needed to fix. And I'm hoping that instead of people going out and having a day of rage, they have a day of peace. Because once this gets out of hand, this is exactly what the U.S. government central bankers want. We know they will use agent provocateurs. Just look for those people dressed in black with black masks, doing things that the other protesters, the other people aren't doing. Just look for those people that are throwing garbage cans, throwing Molotov cocktails, trying to get things started. And this is what we need to watch very, very carefully. So if you're in any of those cities, have your camera ready and get ready to film what is going on and look for those people. Now, there was new leaked data, and this was a joint investigation by The Intercept and 100 reporters, which reveals the chaotic and largely unknown details of a vast global training exercise, operations, facilities, and schools. It's a shadowy network of U.S. programs that every year provides instruction and assistance to approximately 200,000 foreign soldiers, police, and other personnel. The investigation, that exposes the geographic and political contours of the U.S. training system that, up until now, has been very secretive. The data shows that no fewer than 471 locations in 120 countries on every continent, involving on the U.S. side 100 defense agencies, civilian agencies, armed forces, colleges, defense training centers, military units, private companies, and NGOs, as well as National Guard forces of 5 states, despite the fact that the Department of Defense alone has poured $122 billion into such programs since 9/11, the breadth and content of this training network remains virtually unknown to most Americans. So how was the system discovered? Well, there were 6,176 diplomatic cables that was released from WikiLeaks in 2010-2011. And they went through this, and they researched it. And the investigation shows that this is going on. And there is no oversight, safeguards, accountability for any of this. The vetting procedures designed to weed out human rights abusers or terrorists or anything like that is really not being done. Now we can see how they build these forces, how they're able to create these troops these terrorists in all these different areas. The cables also reveal that more than 2/3 of the State Department's vetting approvals were granted for training programs carried out overseas rather in the United States. Training was also conducted in 39 U.S. states, as well as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the District of Columbia. And at least 57 domestic Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps bases were involved in the domestic training efforts. There's no oversight. The vetting is absolutely awful, or there was none at all. There were no safeguards. And from all of this, we can see how this is being used to create these groups around the world to have regime change, to create terrorism. It's all being done in a shadow network. Now, across the globe, we understand that the U.S. has bases all over the place, hundreds and hundreds of bases. And what we're seeing is that the people, the local support, well, the U.S. is losing it. For instance, in Japan, the people in Okinawa, they are protesting continually. We see in many other countries are saying that they do not want the U.S. in their countries. They don't want these bases. They object to it. And this is starting to spread. Actually, we've seen this before in the Roman Empire, where many of the countries started to turn on the Romans that were garrisoned in their countries. And we're starting to see this today happen to the U.S. because if you really look at it, the U.S. is garrisoned in many different countries around the world, and the people are saying, what are you doing here? Now, there was a report that was released, and it's saying that the U.S. missile defense system will not be able to protect the U.S. against a nuclear attack. It is simply unable to protect the U.S. public. Now, the report, which is going to be released by the Union of Concerned Scientists, recommends that the Obama administration halt the expansion of the ground-based mid-course defense system known as the GMD until its technical problems have been solved. And the GMD is intended to thwart limited nuclear strike by a non-superpower adversary, and they're saying it just doesn't work. And we can see right now this has nothing to do with about having military equipment work. It's about funding the military-industrial complex. I mean, look at the F-35. Look at the new destroyers that are coming out. Most of them are having major problems. They don't work. They're not designed very well. They don't do what the pamphlet says they're going to do. And we're having major, major problems. And if we look at the Chinese, we look at Russia, many of their weapon systems are equal to the U.S. or even more advanced than the U.S. And actually they work. And this is going to be a big problem. And a lot of the military is looking at this and they're saying, yes, this is a problem. We can't go head to head with Russia or China because we just don't have the military equipment to do this at this point. And this is why war is not a good idea whatsoever. But again, the U.S. government, central bankers, the neocons, they don't care. Their push is for war. The central bankers need the war to cover up this entire economic collapse. Now, Saudi Arabia, they are still fighting in Yemen, but for the second time in a row, this month, they have bombed their own troops near the Yemeni capital. So right now, the Saudi forces are bombing themselves. And the Houthis are still making huge amount of gains in Yemen. And we can see that this war in Yemen is not going well for Saudi Arabia, the U.S. proxy army, the U.S. And if we look around the Middle East, it is not going well at all in all of the countries. Things are really starting to break down. And we can see the people are definitely rising up. This is why we see more and more troops headed into the Middle East. And we can see that this is going to continually build into all-out war breaks out in these regions. Look at Sudan, look at Yemen, look at Libya, look at Lebanon, look at Iraq, look at Syria. Everything the U.S. government tried to do by changing the elected governments, it has all failed, and it is falling apart very, very quickly. Now, as we know, the U.S., they're backed into a corner right now. And the Islamic State, they on the brink of defeat. There's no other way to look at this point. We see the Iraqi and the Kurdish forces, they're bearing down on them in the east. Syrian forces backed by Iran and Russia, they're pummeling them in the west. And the Islamic State territory is being chipped away a little more every day. In fact, the Islamic State is beginning to admit to its followers that their caliphate is no longer for this world. And they know the end is coming soon. And the forces, well, they can just keep up the fighting for so long. The U.S. understands this because we can see that they're losing territory very, very quickly. Now, we're seeing a lot of information come out of Turkey lately. And we're hearing a lot in the corporate media saying that Turkey is working to normalize its ties with Syria. Now, Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim said that his country is working for the normalization of diplomatic relations with Syria. Now, Saudi Arabia stepped in, and all of a sudden, the Turkish Prime Minister decided to withdraw his comments on normalization. He said, well, as long as Assad is in power, there'll be no change in his country's policy towards Syria. So, in one hand, he's looking for normalization. On the other hand, it looks like he was tapped on the shoulder and said, no, this is not what you're doing. And we can see that Turkey is back saying that, no, Assad must leave. Now, Turkey has stepped up security in Istanbul. Everything is on high alert. We understand that France closed their embassy, and we know there's travel warnings all over the place. And we can see at this point that the U.S., right now, they're in a position where either they go along with Russia, they take out the rest of the terrorists, and they leave Syria, or they do something else. Well, Assad right now is saying that the U.S. airstrikes in Syria, they're completely illegal and counterproductive. And says the U.S. is not serious about destroying the Islamic State. He's saying while the Americans were bombing in his country, terrorism expanded. And it didn't shrink. It only shrunk when the Russians intervened. So whatever the U.S. is doing, it's counterproductive. He also claims that Russia unmasked U.S. plans regarding terrorism. Russia has shown the U.S. supports terrorism. And this is absolutely true, which we've discussed many, many times before. And then we have this leaked document. Now, this came out a couple days ago, where there's a proposal to Russia from the U.S. And the draft proposal was obtained by the Washington Post, and it just so happened to get out there while John Kerry is visiting Russia, where the U.S. is seeking to create a joint headquarters with Russia to share intelligence and conduct synchronized strikes on the Islamic State in Syria. Except there's a catch. Well, one, they can't hit the opposition forces. Two, if there's al-Nusra or al-Qaeda intertwined in the opposition forces, they can't hit the forces. But the leaked document went on to say that they want to set up a command and control structure called the Joint Implementation Group to be installed outside the Jordanian capital. Now, is the U.S. saying that, yes, we want to go and get rid of all terrorism in Syria? Allow the Syrian army to take control of all these areas? Well, I can't see it happening. It'd be nice if we can do that and the U.S. could leave Syria and leave the other countries alone, but we know this is not going to happen. They must be doing this for a different reason. One, they can track and find out where Russia is attacking by coordinating their intelligence. The U.S. could give them false intelligence where they're bombing pretty much absolutely nothing. Or if it is true, they have the ability to warn their terrorist groups ahead of time. Now, they're expected to offer this to Russia, and we'll have to see how Russia responds, because if Russia rejects it, the U.S. is going to say, look, we extended a hand. Russia didn't want to join our force. This is another way they can say that Russia is not working with the U.S. But remember, Russia has asked the U.S. multiple times to join them in the fight against terrorism. There was only one stipulation. Give us a list and separate the terrorists from your moderate rebels. And this was the sticking point from the beginning. So we're going to have to watch the U.S.'s next move very, very carefully, because they spent all of these years, billions upon billions of dollars, to remove Assad. Can they just walk away from this? Maybe they're doing this to save face. They did this back in 2013 when Russia made a suggestion of Assad removing his chemical weapons. But remember, their goal was always the same. Because here we are in 2016 doing the same exact thing. So we're going to have to watch this, because their proxy army is losing ground very quickly. And their next move is going to be very interesting. Now, the White House came out and they said the United States is not coordinating with Russia right now, and saying that there is some speculation that an agreement may be reached to do so, but it's not clear that this will happen, which tells me that they're going to present it to Russia, and they're hoping Russia rejects it or says you need to separate the terrorists from the moderate rebels, and the U.S. can just come back and say they rejected our offer, and they can go out and say, look, see, Russia doesn't want to work with us. And this is why we see the bases being built. This is why we see the French building a base in Syria. This is why the U.S. is there illegally. This is why we see 2 aircraft carriers and the strike groups there. This is why the Charles de Gaulle is going to be joining the U.S. later this summer. This is why Russia has their aircraft carrier there. So we're going to have to watch this very, very carefully. Now, Russia has never discussed with Assad about stepping down. They talked to him about an election, having the people decide, and all we hear is the transition. Now, this is supposed to happen August 1st. This is what the U.S. wants. And if you notice, this leaked document, all of this is happening 2 weeks or so before August 1st, during this transitional period. So this whole thing is very interesting. We're going to have to watch it very, very carefully, because I can see at this point that the U.S., they are up to something, and it's not in the best interests of Syria or Russia. Now, FBI Director James Comey, he is predicting an exodus of the Islamic State fighters spreading worldwide as they prepare for the potential fall of the so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria, warning everyone that the Islamic State will become increasingly desperate to launch attacks everywhere. So what they're saying is when all else fails, they're going to have an event. And we know their proxy army, the Islamic State, they're losing in Syria and Iraq. And the last thing they're going to do is strike out. The U.S. is backed in a corner. The only thing they have left is either to join Russia, get rid of the Islamic State, get rid of Al-Qaeda, get rid of al-Nusra, and just have, the 2 or 3 soldiers from the moderate rebels standing there saying, what do we do now? Or it's time for them to go in and do something horrific with an event, with starting a war. There's a reason why Jay Johnson was in Turkey. There's a reason why there's all these travel warnings. There's a reason why the air bases were built. There's a reason why the strike groups are already in the Mediterranean. There's a reason why France is bringing their aircraft carrier in. There's a reason why Turkey got HIMAR missile system on their borders. There's a reason why NATO is flying their AWACS across the borders of Turkey and Syria. There's a reason all of this is happening at the same time. And we're getting closer and closer. Hopefully, Putin will be able to talk the United States down from whatever they're planning. He's done it before. We can see that he's not looking for a war. But on the other side, the U.S., they're looking for a war. They're looking to cover up this economic collapse. Putin has already warned us when he gave his speech to journalists that the U.S., neocons, they're pushing for World War III. They're pushing for a nuclear war. And China, Russia, they understand that they're going to continually provoke until they get this started. And this is exactly what they're doing. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.